Hi, I'm Drew Levanti, and welcome back to Elections Weekly, a show where we take a look at the week ahead through the lens of electional astrology. Thanks everybody for coming back, and thank you to all the new viewers joining for the first time. These videos come out every Monday, and in these videos we look at elections, which are specific moments on a given day, a specific moment that in that moment, certain things can come to be that cannot come to be at other moments. So we look at these charts, we look at these specific moments and try to understand what the sky is inviting at this time. Now, while this series and this channel is geared toward electional astrology, I also do a lot of natal astrology, and I'm very passionate about natal astrology, looking at people's birth charts, helping them understand the dynamics in their birth chart, and getting in tune with the shape of your life at an astrological level in order to enrich our experience. And so I am booking sessions for the rest of March. I have a couple sessions available for the rest of March, and you can also be booking for April right now. So hop over to the links in the video description for that, as well as some helpful information on electional astrology if you have some more questions about that. I've been on some podcasts and things like that, so you can check out the resources page on my website for that, which will also be linked in the video description. So our first chart for the week is going to be Tuesday, March 15th at approximately 5:03 p.m. And so this chart, we're looking at a Virgo rising. I, in my location, have approximately 3 or 4 degrees of Virgo rising. And you should put the midheaven of this chart so that it is in an aspect, like in the same range of degrees as the moon. So in my location, the moon's at 26 degrees of Leo, so I've put the midheaven at about 28 degrees of Leo. You just want that midheaven to be within about 3 degrees of that moon, because what that's going to do, and this is a technique that I've borrowed from Chris Brennan, what that's going to do is it's going to give the secrecy and the hidden qualities of the 12th house moon somewhere to go. So in other words, those things that might otherwise be unspoken or hidden at a given time are going to be brought into the light in some way. Oftentimes when the moon is in the 12th house, there is, and I'm talking about in an electional context, there is something that is not being spoken or something that is not entirely clear or being articulated in a clear way, and something that somebody might even be trying to suppress. And when that happens, that's something that we deal with all the time. And when we have a chart like this where the midheaven is connected to the moon in the 12th house, there's a sense in which we can bring things that are in the darkness into the light a little bit, smoothly or gently. And especially with this Mercury being in Pisces, the planet that is ruling the chart, ruling this Virgo rising, this Mercury, the planet of communication and articulation and language, in Pisces, Mercury is not communicating with language in a normal way or in a way that is valued by society typically. So we're not dealing with communication that is precise and about clear information or clear directives of what to do with information. Instead, we're dealing with a sort of communication that is a bit more elusive and a bit more evocative, something that is trying to inspire a vision of something or articulate not so much the details as much as it is articulating the broad shape or the overarching narrative, the theme, something bigger. And so these are the kinds of communicative ways that you can engage with this chart. The kinds of communication that you can bring into being under this chart are these more esoteric or poetic or elusive ways of communicating that articulate a theme rather than something very specific. And what's cool about this chart, again, we've seen this a couple times in the past, charts from the past couple weeks, where Mercury is moving into a conjunction with Jupiter. And so there's a sense that these unconventional ways of communicating are being received well by another party, perhaps the person to whom you're sending a message, or perhaps the person or the party, the group that is the audience for this communication is going to receive it. There's a technical condition in this chart known as reception, where Mercury is in Jupiter's sign, and Mercury is moving toward Jupiter. And so Jupiter is receiving Mercury in Jupiter's house. And so what this shows is that there is harmony between these two parties. And although Mercury is not giving its typical lens on things, it is working in a more unconventional manner. That unconventionality is actually respected by Jupiter and is being offered support by Jupiter. Now, this is a chart where, again, the moon is in the 12th and there is quite a lot going on in the 6th. So this could be some kind of work situation where perhaps you feel a little bit out of your depth, or there's an employment context here. Like you are working for somebody who is your superior, and they are fortunately quite generous, but there might still be some high demands on your time or high demands on your energy. And this might be a little bit stressful because you're having to do things in a way that you're not used to doing them. And that can be stressful. But there's plenty of support in this chart to make it go well. Just being mindful of overwhelm and the limits of one's energy, especially with the moon opposing Saturn in this chart. And depending on where you are in the world, this Saturn is potentially like really, really riding the moon. Like if you're in the Eastern Hemisphere, especially like further in the Eastern Hemisphere, then this opposition between the moon and Saturn is going to be pretty tight. And that is something that can indicate blockages or things not going your way, or needing to take extra time or extra devotion for something to work out well. So those are some things to keep in mind with this chart. As we move on, we'll take a look at the chart for the 16th. And the 16th is a pretty cool one, if I do say so myself. So we're still working with this Mercury-Jupiter conjunction, right? So instead of having Mercury ruling the chart in this one, we have Mercury on the MC with Jupiter. And so what's special about this is that it shows some kind of communication in public, right? So whereas the previous chart that we looked at was more of like a one-on-one communication, this one has a lot more publicity. There's a sense of like announcing something to the world, like being in a high place from which your voice will resound around the meeting hall or the gathering hall or whatever kind of space you're in, whether that's a digital space or a real space. And this style of communication, which is the Mercury and Pisces kind, like the esoteric and the elusive and the elusive, like alluding to things imprecisely and speaking thematically, these things are being announced. We're communicating in public in these ways. At the same time, the moon is actually ruling the chart, and we see the moon here in the 3rd sign and also very close to the IC. And so this moon ruling the chart is speaking from that base of the chart, from that root of the chart where things have to do with origins and also privacy and the past. And so there's a sense of shining a light into the past, shining a light into where we come from and what we know because of where we come from. I noticed that this moon is quite full. It's approaching fullness. It'll be full within the next couple days, and it's actually in the sign that's opposite the sun, which is where the full moon happens. So there is a growth of light here, a full flourishing that is being received by, or that is being channeled through some kind of public presentation. So there's this really fascinating relationship between the IC and the MC here, the root and the branches, if you will, the height of the tree, the flourishing of this life. With the water rising in particular, and Mercury and Jupiter and the sun in Pisces, there's quite a bit of water in this chart. And so if you have something going on in your life that has to do with water, maybe that is fixing the water in your home, that would be a really excellent chart for this. It could be calling for water to be more accessible to you. It could be any number of things that have to do with water, journeys by water, travel by water. These are things that make sense with this chart because we see that the 9th sign of Pisces is the 9th sign in this chart if we count from Cancer, That has to do with foreign travel. And then the third sign where the moon is positioned is local travel. So there's a transient quality of this chart where we're moving between places and between ideas. We're reflecting on what has already come to pass. And these are the main themes of this chart that I wanted to highlight. We do have quite a bit in the eighth house as well. And the eighth house can have to do with resources that are promised in time, promised in the future, but you might have to wait. There's a sense of idleness or waiting that has to do with the eighth house. And so there might be some things to do with other people's resources that, or other like systemic resources that are somehow delaying what's going on. But there is quite a bit of cardinality or initiative, and there's quite a bit of initiative in this chart as well. And you just have to kind of roll with the mutability, roll with the, it could be this way, it could be that way, roll with the double, the bicorporeal nature, all of these mutable words where things could be one way and they could be the other way. And navigating that ambiguity is something that is supported in this chart. So yeah, I like this one quite a bit. Let's go on to the 17th. The 17th, we're looking at a Pisces rising. And so this chart is a sunrise chart on Thursday. We have about 27 degrees of Pisces rising. The important part is that the sun is at the ascendant or slightly past it. And so in my location, that happens to be 7:04 a.m. Check in your location what time sunrise is, and then just do it at that time. And what we are gaining by having it at or slightly after sunrise by a minute or two is that we get the hour of Jupiter. We get the day and hour of Jupiter. And this is asking a planet that is really supportive in the sky right now for help. And when we embody Jupiter, when we make Jupiter the ruler of the ascendant, we are essentially asking, we're inviting ourselves into a space of optimism, of hope, and of mutual support and camaraderie. You know, I think that the people who go the furthest are the people who support their peers and the people who try to lift other people up as they rise. And this is something that, you know, there's a generosity to Jupiter that I think really resonates with these themes. And I see the moon in the seventh house here. And again, this moon is getting very close to full, and the moon is in an opposition with Jupiter. So there's like a stretching quality to this moon in the seventh house, reaching out, you know, outreach being a very useful purpose for this chart, where maybe offering your help to somebody. I like to use that kind of thinking when the moon is in the seventh house of an election, stretching our capacity for another person, especially with this opposition between the moon and the sun, between the moon and Jupiter, the moon and Mercury. This oppositional quality is about a distance between us, and bridging that distance is something that can sometimes be uncomfortable depending on, you know, if the moon has like challenging aspects or if there are malefic influences. But this moon in particular is one that has so much support and is being supportive for another. So these are some things that I like to see in this chart. I also see that there's quite a bit on the 12th. And so while the 12th can involve themes like hidden enemies or self-undoing, these are some of the 12th house themes that are pretty common. The 12th can also be things that are hidden or things that are out of sight, people who are out of sight. And so that doesn't necessarily mean that they are negative or that they're operating counter to your purposes. The positive thing in this chart is that those 12th house individuals or 12th house groups are not really involved in what's going on between the first and the seventh houses. So they are maybe, there might be groups or institutions that are relevant to the relationship in a very oblique or side way, but it's not direct. And so this might be a collaboration that is happening in secret from an institution that is posing some challenges, especially posing challenges for women. So the reason that I go here is because we see that Venus in this chart is besieged. Venus is between a conjunction of Mars and a conjunction of Saturn. And so when Venus is in a position like this, traditionally this would be seen as a threat to the security of women, or a threat to the well-being of women, and also violence being something that is in play here. And so with this first and seventh house dynamic happening in really positive ways, while there is this more shadowy, potentially misogynistic or unjust activities toward women happening in the 12th, and we could also maybe extend this to issues of gender and the rejection of certain gender expressions as well. Maybe we could think about what's going on right now with all of this anti-trans legislation, especially around children. And this makes me think as well about Mercury's position in this chart. Mercury is the planet that rules children. As a general kind of, if we had to choose one planet to rule children, it would be Mercury, because it's Mercury's small and young. Mercury is fallen in this chart, and it's being received by this beautiful Jupiter who rules the ascendant. And so there might be a sense of taking somebody in or offering a child help with this chart. We see that the moon rules the fifth sign of the chart, and so that opposition between the moon, Jupiter, and Mercury gives us a sense that there's a lot of assistance being offered for children. There's so much going on in the United States politics right now, and around gender and all the abortion stuff and all of the trans rights for children stuff like that is, I think, something that's happening in alignment with the nodes being in Taurus and Scorpio, actually. And so that's something that I'm going to be keeping an eye on as we move into the eclipses in Taurus and Scorpio later on. But let's move on to the 19th. We could talk about this chart for a while. I think it's so interesting. So this one is we're going for a Cancer rising here. We've got about 8 degrees of Cancer rising. I'm on March 19th, Saturday at 12:10 p.m. The moon is ruling the ascendant in Libra, and it is moving into a trine with Saturn, while once again we do have Mercury and Jupiter on the midheaven, with the sun about to enter Aries, but still in that last terminal degree of Pisces. So this chart does put quite a bit of emphasis on home, with the moon ruling the ascendant and also being in the fourth sign of the chart. This could have to do with getting financial support, or some kind of, not directly financial support, but some kind of, maybe, like, it makes me think of when you are looking for a lease and you need to put down money for like the security deposit or something. Like, there's some sense that we're like bending time with these 8th house planets, where we have to maybe put up a little bit more right now in order to have the security later. So there is a sense of like compromise in this chart, where there might be some extra expenses, but in terms of securing housing, this is a chart where it's not entirely smooth, but through the deployment of additional resources, the security can be achieved. It might just be a little bit Saturnian. It might be a little bit like you have to make sacrifices, or you have to fully understand the consequences of these financial decisions in order for it to go well. Mercury, once again, culminating on the midheaven, is not the most important part of this chart, but it actually is the hour of Mercury, and so maybe that actually is pretty important. Being in conversation with these issues around home and also debt, between the 4th and the 8th house that I'm kind of alluding to, it's very important to have clear agreements in place. So don't skimp on the details just to be expedient or just to be easy and agreeable. And find agreements that are spacious, that are allowing, and Jupiterian, spacious like Jupiter, in order to facilitate the ambiguities of the situation that you find yourself in with respect to home and living situation. So let's move on to the 20th. The 20th, we're looking at approximately 2:02 p.m. on Sunday. So that's going to have about 2 degrees of Leo rising. And so this chart, you know, this is a chart where the moon is once again in the fourth house. It's so funny that I'm choosing all of these like lunar kind of fourth house elections because I am in the process of some things with my own living situation. And I always find that I tend to choose elections for this series that somehow resonate with what's going on in my own life. And that's just the way that the astrology announces itself in my life. It's not even conscious that I do this, but this chart is one that is a lot about aspiration and a lot about reaching for a new place, whether that's a physical place, like a location, or a new place in the mind, or a new place philosophically, some new vantage point from which to view the world. And with the moon in the fourth house, it does lend itself to or the fourth sign, it does lend itself to a physical place, a home, while at the same time there is, with the moon, or excuse me, with the sun ruling the ascendant in the ninth, we're looking at, and exalted for that matter, we're looking at a sun that has just entered its exaltation. There's a newness and a freshness to this chart. I should add that for some people, the sun will still be in Pisces. So just double check in your location if the sun is still in Pisces at the Leo rising chart here at about 2:02 p.m. on Sunday. However, the sun, if it is in Aries, this lends itself to a new way of seeing things, and a way of seeing things from a place of elevation, you know, and a place of reaching out. And the sun here is ruled by this Mars that's in the seventh house. So the seventh house here is quite active, where we see Mars, Venus, and Saturn all in the seventh. And so the partnership element of this is potentially relevant, where there's a lot of activity with a partner. Maybe there's a sense in which you're moving, or you're moving toward a partner, or there's some kind of complications with respect to a partner. And at the same time, that Mars there rules the sun. So there's this seventh, ninth house connection. And one of the things that happens in the seventh house that in elections and in horaries that doesn't get talked about in a natal context because it's just not as relevant, where the sun, the seventh house is also destinations. It's like, if you have the ninth house, which is the travel, like the journey, the trip, the seventh is like the place you're going. And with Mars, Venus, and Saturn in the seventh house, this could actually be a really interesting travel election where you're looking to meet people. You're looking to make long-lasting connections, in particular, where we have Saturn kind of reining in the passion and the volatility of this Venus-Mars conjunction. Saturn is bringing these seventh house planets into a structure, into an agreement. And so this can actually be a really good chart for agreeing to some kind of contract or something with somebody who is maybe older, somebody who has a lot of resources to offer. You know, we see this Jupiter in the eighth of the chart with Mercury, who rules the second. And so there's a sense of resources being offered by another, you know, if you're, this is an interesting kind of chart for sex work. I'll throw that out there in case that's relevant for anybody in the audience. So on our Monday chart, we're going to find a Gemini rising at approximately 11:05 a.m. I've got 25 degrees of Gemini rising in my location. The moon here is still in Scorpio. And so with a Gemini rising, we really are digging into that Mercury and Pisces conjunct Jupiter. And it's in the 10th house of this chart. I will add that in addition to having 25-ish of Gemini, the more important thing actually is to have the midheaven in Pisces. Make sure you get that midheaven in Pisces so that the midheaven is ruled by Jupiter. So if we're looking for maybe something to do with career here, then we're getting that Jupiter rulership over career rather than a Saturn rulership over career. Now, the moon in this chart is quite afflicted, you could say. It is in the 6th in Scorpio with the South Node and squaring Saturn as its next aspect. If you have it applying to Venus in your location like it is in mine, that's a little bit nicer, but this moon is quite chaotic. And so not using this chart for anything to do with home or living situation, but rather using it for something to do with writing, something to do with mercurial topics of the Mercury and Pisces nature that I've already talked about earlier in this video. At the same time, we have a very powerful sun at 1 degree of Aries. It might be 0 degrees of Aries in your location. And this is in the 11th sign of the chart, kind of scooting over there into the 10th quadrant house. And what's fascinating about this is that it does speak to like powerful alliances and people who can support you. Like, you know, the king is in the 11th. So benefactors, kingly benefactors, people with a lot of influence, and getting proximate with them, getting closer to them is really interesting in this chart because of that connection between Mercury and Jupiter in the 10th, where one rules the 1st, one rules the 7th. This is a pattern that we've seen. If you're a repeat viewer of the show, then you know that I talk a lot about immutable rising charts where it's like Gemini rising. We talk about, okay, what are Mercury and Jupiter doing in relation to each other? Because this is going to describe some kind of relationship dynamic in the chart. So in addition to that coming together of two parties, then we have this sun in the 11th sign that is exalted. And so this lends itself more to the benefactor side, which Jupiter is already into the benefactor thing. So this is a good chart for attracting benefactors as long as you're willing to accept a little bit of sixth houseness, or a little bit of being employed, or being, you know, at the whim of somebody. Sometimes you have to make some, you know, I mean, this isn't always the case, but sometimes there are compromises that have to be made in terms of one's sovereignty in order to access sovereignty in the long run. Maybe that's a contestable claim. I'm not sure. It's something that I'm still learning about. So take that as you will. And I hope that these elections have been helpful for you this week. I hope that there's something here for you. And I will be back next week on Monday. As a reminder, sign up for my newsletter, because my newsletter will be dropping like Wednesday or Thursday of this week. And I would really love to share what's in that. It's like very content driven and trying to be very helpful for you to navigate the sky weather and to be in tune with the sky weather, I think, more than anything else. So I'll be writing about attunement and more about this Mercury-Jupiter conjunction and what we might invite into our lives at this time. So that link will also be down below. Thank you for liking, commenting, and subscribing to my channel. It really, really helps. And especially if you like this video, that would be a great way to let me know. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining this week, and I will see you next Monday.